Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another edition of Hilaal Live. I'm your host, Luqman Shadrack. It's Mental Health Monday, and we have our regular and resident clinical psychologist back in studio. I'm not sure if he comes to analyze me or gives advice. Brother Rafiq Lockhat, Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Shukr so much for affording us your time once again. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
And because today's topic is one that is so important and needs quite a bit of advice, we thought we would invite an educational specialist into studio, Dr. Yusuf Lalken, who's an educational psychologist. Assalamu alaikum, Doc. Welcome.
Wa alaikum salam.
Jazakallah, nice meeting up with you again. We've done some radio interviews over the years, and you're always a stalwart of the community. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
So today's topic, ADHD, is one that we often hear. We sometimes don't know too much about it. And I think with the two gentlemen working in the industry in terms of ADHD, maybe Rafiq, from some of your experience in working with people with ADHD, maybe not as much as Dr. Yusuf, maybe give us a broader explanation. What is ADHD? How does it affect our everyday life?
I think before we get there, we often talk about helping our listeners, our viewers understand things. So like I said last time, depression is used so loosely. ADHD is also used for everything. It's actually used as a swear word. It's used to criticize people.
Right.
So what when people do that, it takes the value away from the actual diagnosis of ADHD. You say, you've got ADHD, man. You put fidgety, you've got ADHD. If you're jumping, you've got ADHD. So it loses the actual real quality. So we're hoping that today we'll educate our viewers into how not to make anything you've got ADHD. So hopefully that will clear up. That's one of the big things and that's why I thought Yusuf will come in. He is the expert in the field. Yusuf also was very smart. He managed to fool me and threw some years ago my surprise 50th birthday party. Totally fooled me. Invited me to his house to come see his new house.
Right.
Walking around 15 minutes.
Surprise.
And he said, come, I'll show you the cellar. We go down over the thing, and it's like people. I'm very confused. He did that so smoothly.
It can only be another psychologist to do that too.
He did that so smoothly. It was just a work of art the way he pulled that off.
So it's so glad that you have to take time out to enjoy the little things as well. But Dr. Yusuf, as an education psychologist, how does ADHD impact maybe the academic performance, especially we've got our matrics right here now, our VIPs of our scholastic environment. How does it affect them?
Sure. Before we get to the impact of ADHD, I think it's a good thing in terms of what Rafiq just said, to clarify to our audience exactly what ADHD is. And so we go to what we normally refer to as the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which guides psychologists and psychiatrists in defining psychological problems. And the definition of ADHD, it says that it's a neurobiological, neurodevelopmental disorder that impacts on attention, it impacts on concentration, it causes impulsivity, distractibility, and lack of concentration. So it is a condition that's fairly well defined with clear stipulations at what constitutes each one of those categories that psychologists then use in order to identify learners with ADHD. The identification process is fairly complex, so it's not clearly a once-off visit to a psychologist. It normally involves a consultation with the parents, information to be provided by educators themselves. The child himself provides information, particularly when you're an adolescent. You're fairly aware of what happens and what is not working for you. You just find it very difficult to articulate that. And so at least when we come to see a psychologist, we create the space where you can begin to identify some of those concerns. So when a learner is identified with ADHD, it is quite a relief, I think, for the child himself to finally get a sense of people get me. They understand what the challenges are that I've been dealing with for years. And everybody else said to me, you're naughty,
You're right.
You don't listen.
And here is where the misdiagnosis
With the
comes in.
misdiagnosis. And I always say to parents, naughty is not a diagnosis, So they do struggle quite a bit academically, because clearly if you lack focus and concentration, it simply means that much of what happens in the classroom you don't process adequately.
Right.
Yeah.
What are some of the misconceptions when it comes to ADHD? Are there myths out there?
Well, I think the myths is not so much around ADHD as a category. The myths are prevalent culturally in our community and socially, where they seem to suggest that it cannot be that. It has to be simply a child who's being difficult,
right.
A child who refuses to listen and follow instructions. And if we can get the child just to listen and understand what we are trying to tell them, then all the problems will be solved. One of the key things about ADHD, it doesn't connect well with reasoning. You cannot persuade a child to do something if there is this neurological disorder that makes it extremely difficult for them to do so. And the difficult part is, I think every single child that I've ever met wants to do well at school.
Of course.
They want to produce good results. They want to bring home good results. They want to be happy. And for some other reason, somewhere along that journey, things don't work out very well.
Yeah.
And it's that point that parents need to begin to recognize, let's consult people about this condition.
Right.
And let's see whether it is something that we may have missed that we can actually support the child with.
Right. Has there been research or has there been stats showing that ADHD may be of a genetic disorder or a passed down from parent to child?
Yeah. That's a fascinating question, because very often when I provide feedback to parents about their child, and I take a bit of time, sometimes up to 45 minutes, to describe their child to them based on the information that they've provided. So I'm almost telling them back to them what they've told me, but I put it in a storyline. I put it in this particular context. I tell them what the teachers have told me. I tell them what the child has told me. I tell them what I found out about the child. And probably 80% of the time, the father would turn to me and he would say, I was like that when I was at school.
Wow.
Sometimes the mom would say, I was like that when I was at school. And then you can see in their faces a recognition that they finally have of what it is the child is going through, because that's exactly what it was like for them. So research has clearly proven a clear genetic link between ADHD and genetics.
All right. The big question always comes about is, how do we identify whether a child is ADHD, especially in a bigger classroom? We have in various communities that up to 40, 50 children in a classroom. I mean, a teacher or parent for that matter, and invariably parents work long hours, don't spend as much time with their children, sometimes may miss that they're ADHD.
So ADHD has certain sort of co-occurrence features as well. I think the more obvious one at school would be a lack of academic performance. So that's the first indicator. Second indicator would probably be with girls in particular, they become withdrawn a little bit. They become quieter. They lack that spontaneity that parents know they had when they started schooling, and teachers will pick that up. The child has become very quiet. Boys, on the other hand, become a little bit more outward, and they act out a little bit more, and they backchat a little bit more, and people begin to notice that. So I would always say that the first place to recognize ADHD is often in schools itself. So I agree with you, 40 learners makes it extremely difficult. But if we provide, I think, the average teacher with a bit of a template, and we say, what can you tell me about this learner? These are some of the features I want you to compare that learner with. It's such an easy job. They start ticking off. And they even can grade it. They can say, it's a little bit of that, but it's a lot of that. And then you begin to get a picture of what that learner is like in class. and that you can then relate to some of the learning challenges, some of the emotional problems, and some of the behavior issues that is connected, I think, with ADHD.
Are we doing more of a concerted effort to make that, maybe a project or go on a campaign in our communities?
I don't think enough has been done. I mean, if that is the question. I think the Department of Education have attempted to establish what they call school-based support teams.
Okay.
A group of teachers have shown an indication, a willingness, and an interest, and maybe a little bit of expertise. I've done a Psychology 3 in my studies and so on. To set up a school-based support team that can provide support, first of all, to their fellow teachers. Because teachers are inevitably overwhelmed with work, and they're kind of focusing on academic targets. But if that team can then begin to advise teachers to just sit back a little bit and identify the learners, and from that they can begin to do a process that I think is intended to be run at school. Whether how successful it is, it's questionable. But it's called the SIAS process, which stands for Screening, Identification, Assessment and Support. So the intention of that SIAS process is really for schools to do an educational intervention, failing which, if it doesn't work, naturally means a psychological intervention. So we're hoping at schools that process obviously is in place at least. How well it can work will depend on the management and many other factors as well.
We're chatting to Rafiq Lockhat, clinical psychologist and educational psychologist, Dr. Yusuf Lalken, about ADHD. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we continue with this very important topic. You are still watching Hilaal Live. Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to Hilaal Live. Thanks for watching us on channel 347. We're discussing on Mental Health Mondays, ADHD, and I'm sure we've all been talking about this for many years, but not fully understanding how this condition presents itself in our communities. And I've decided to invite into studio Brother Rafiq Lockhat, who is our regular clinical psychologist, and then educational psychologist, Dr. Yusuf Lalken. Gentlemen, Jazakallah so much for coming into studio. I'm learning a lot just from the information that's been passed as well. But before the break, one of the things I mentioned was that it's that time of the year where our kiddos, and a lot of people, not just kiddos, are writing exams, and we want to give them the greatest of respect, make them that, give them that VIP treatment and allow them to go through this process. However, in saying that, for those that are struggling with ADHD or managing their ADHD, are there any special concessions allowed for, especially in our scholastic environment, for kiddos to write the exam?
So I think one of the key issues about ADHD is an inability for learners to begin to organize themselves. In fact, research has shown that there's a kind of an atypical interaction between the frontal cortex, which is normally known for managing our executive functioning, so our planning, our organization, our execution of tasks, and even our ability to reason, to put things in a particular order so that it comes out the way we intended it to. So we know with ADHD children, that particular area is a bit compromised, and so it impacts on how they organize themselves and how they process information. Now, when you say that, you can immediately understand how difficult it is to study.
Absolutely. Yes.
Study requires a lot of planning, a lot of commitment, a lot of perseverance to sit through the hours. And ADHD children struggle with that. They sometimes get it, they understand clearly what is expected, but when they have to formulate the response in an exam, they sometimes blank out, which is the typical sort of issue that parents raise. My request to parents and to schools just generally is be a lot more observant of your young people. Don't wait for the matric year in order to panic, because panic will happen with everybody. But there's nothing worse for a parent of an ADHD child to panic, and the child panics. So try to get an intervention and some level of support in place to the child much earlier on. Once they have that, then I think they're in a better position to be relaxed about exams, to be less stressed about exams, and to be able to organize themselves more effectively.
Gotcha.
So I would suggest to parents that if you have concerns around performance, number one, do the normal thing, go to a tutor, and the more typical problem would always be the tutor says he understands or she understands perfectly. I can't understand why the exam results are so bad.
Right.
Well, there's a lot of, between the cup and the lip,
Gotcha.
there's a problem.
Yeah.
And so what they understand in a one-to-one interaction, they're unable to retain and organize and reproduce when it
It's
comes
that
to
big
exam.
match temperament
That's correct.
that may just hit
So
them
well,
as well.
added to that is the
Yes.
big temperament,
As
the
well.
moment of
Correct.
exam, and
Correct.
the kind of anxiety that is generated around matric exams. ADHD kids go through extreme traumatic stress at that particular point.
Wow.
It's so much more worse for them than it is for anybody else. And so early identification is sort of my motto. Rather come to me and we do the assessment and we find it's not a major problem, then we can look at other strategies. But if it is an ADHD problem, then let's look at specific things that we can do.
Gotcha. Rafiq, I want to bring you in at this point. As a clinical psychologist, from time to time people will come to you and you would do a bit of an analysis. And once you find out or that someone presents themselves as having ADHD, what are your next steps? Do you refer them to a specialist like Dr. Lalken? Is there another project or company that you would refer them to for analysis?
So I think the starting point, as Yusuf was saying, if it's not ADHD, great, we can have other strategies.
Right.
But if it is ADHD, you need very specific things. And if you do that incorrectly, you extra traumatizing the child because they're already unsure. I mean, often they'll say, I study so hard, I don't understand. I'm working for hours and I don't understand. And so they become very demoralized.
Right.
And then they want to give up and then they want to, because they don't, they just think, so the first step would be the correct channel, and that would be use somebody like Yusuf, who an educational psychologist usually, or a clinical psychologist who specializes in this. So some people make a speciality out of it. Educational psychologists usually have the tools for that. They've got the right questionnaires, and they know how to manage it. So that would be the first step, is don't muck about and waste the person's time. If you realize it's ADHD, say, listen, go and get the right help, because it can get sorted out. And Yusuf's other point was, waiting for the last minute is not helpful. Because by then everyone's in panic, including the psychologist, who's trying to put fires out quickly so that this child can actually write exams in 2 weeks' time.
And also keep a bit of some sanity within the family structure, because that can really upset the apple cart.
Absolutely.
Knowing that I don't really, or I can't manage the situation with the right help from you guys, that can be managed. When we look at advice, because a lot of people tune into this program, to find out how they can better, handle various conditions. When it comes to ADHD, what advice do you have for the parents, teachers and guardians on how better to handle ADHD, especially this time of the year?
Yeah. Well, I think the first point is to identify the problem and not to misidentify it. If you know what you're dealing with, it's a lot easier to then decide what it is that you're going to do to sort out the problem. So I think early identification is an absolute necessity for issues like these. The longer we wait, the more we allowed additional problems to occur.
Gotcha.
And Rafiq is quite correct. Sometimes when he gets the child, there's been so much happening in that child's life that you're beginning to treat the anxiety, the depression, the stress flowing from the ADHD. And if we had just nipped that in the bud, we could have avoided all of that. So my advice to parents is just be a lot more aware of your children, take an interest in what they do, allow them to at least verbalize some of their concerns. Do not dismiss it. Do not run to the normal responses almost inherent in all parents. Just buck up and get the job done. You can do it. I believe in you. I mean, that kind of talk is encouraging.
Yes.
But if it doesn't deliver any results, then you have to revisit that encouragement and say, well, maybe there's more to it than simply me been encouraging to the learner. So I would suggest early identification is the key word with managing ADHD. And once we have identified a learner, we can introduce a lot of support for them within the school.
Nice.
So inevitably, they would need more than simply therapy or medication. And so we can look at, for example, extra time during the exams of 45 minutes.
And these are the concessions that will be allowed
that
for?
will be available.
Okay.
The Department of Education do not like the idea of people coming in matric year and asking for concessions.
Yeah.
They would want to know, how long has this been a problem? And if we can prove to them we had a diagnosis done when the child was in grade 8 and we had implemented certain measures that had really worked for them, we now ask you to formally and officially approve those measures. They'd be open to that. So there are these concessions that I think that can be made available that makes the writing of exams less stressful.
Less stressful. Rafiq, you wanted to come in at this time.
One of the challenges I found is parent resistance to the diagnosis. Okay, they want to believe, not all, but a lot of people want to that my child is lazy, that the child doesn't listen, I told you so. I think the concept of ADHD is quite frightening for some parents, and that's why shows like this can help.
Yeah.
To get to see, actually, it's not a frightening thing, right? It's a thing, and it's a thing that can be helped. So I find a lot of parents, just the moment you start talking about your child possibly has ADHD, but the shutters come down, and then no, we're going to go somewhere else. We're going to try them out on natural remedies. Not that those are bad things, but you got to, unfortunately, parents don't want to hear. I know that's your experience. Parents find it very hard to hear that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know the Laban comes out every so now and then, just to assist as well.
You're blaming them.
And that's the irony. I mean, they are obviously, like Rafiq said, quite resistant to come to you because they really truly believe that maybe you're going to tell them it's not ADHD. Right. So they come and they're hopeful but quite resistant at the same time. And once we've gone through that process with them, the amount of relief you observe in parents, I feel, first of all, less guilty about my parenting. Maybe it wasn't all my fault.
Gotcha.
It's probably not, and it's not your
because they
fault.
carry that baggage
And they
with
carry
them
that
as a
baggage
parent.
with them all the time. So there's a sense of relief that not only is it something that we've identified, that's real, you've explained it to us, and we recognize all of what you've said, but you've also come with a solution.
Nice.
Something that I can do, something the child can do, something the school can do. And suddenly the problem seems less daunting and can be solved. And there's nothing better than getting a learner coming back the next term and having them come back with a report that says, I've done extremely well, and you see a happy child and a happy parent.
Awesome.
And that's what we're working on.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we've run out of time. We can chat about this for hours on end, and with the research and work that you've done in the community. Jazakallah to both of you for affording us your time and giving off valuable information to our audience. Have a great evening. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
And that's how we end Mental Health Monday. We're back tomorrow between 7 and 7:30. Do look out for another episode of Hilaal Live. From the Cape Town team, Brother Ahmad Mashawi and Mohammed Parker, and from myself, Luqman Shadrack. Have a great evening. Assalamu alaikum.